Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hope everyone is well today. Today is GT Tuesday. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we got a wealth of information for us today. And so just really just kind of doing our wellness check. How's everybody doing out there? Everyone's well? Drop it in the chat. Drop it in the chat. Thank you. Hopefully everyone has had a great spring break, ready for the upcoming week and the weekend. And then next week is GT Awareness Week. All right. As I let people in. All right, good morning. All right, as you know, I always like to remind us of thinking about our state definition and who we're looking for. We're looking for those students who perform at or shows the potential performing at remarkably high levels of accomplishment when compared to others of the same age, experience, and or environment. So really thinking about who are you serving, who are you looking for, how are you doing that? That's a local kind of decision, making that really into your own place in your own world. We're looking for those who have high performance in capability and intellectual, creative, or artistic area that possess that capacity for leadership. And then, you know, how we do it, we're looking for those academic fields, those who are in that level who are excelling. So as we go into today, really hoping that, just a reminder, we only got a few more GT Tuesdays going. We're almost towards the end, got one more in April and then kind of stop for testing. Then we'll come back in May and then we'll be wrapping it up for this year. And then we'll be thinking about next year. As you know, Taggart is actually, what's going on my screens here? Actually is having their leadership conference today. So some of you is out there. And so, want to remind you of the Gifted Ed. I don't think anyone's on for that today. Their next upcoming event is Gifted Week next week. And then also coming up is going to be Gifted Plus later this summer. And I want to say it's in Galveston or Corpus Padre Island, one of the two. I have to remember, but it's on the coast this time. And so, but they will be back with us next time. And Galveston, thank you, Amber. All right. And then just want to remind you that in beginning of, in a couple of weeks, Gifted in Color will be in Austin. And that is a conference held by the Brilliance, Excellence, and Equity Project. And they will be at Houston-Tillotson University. You see the QR code on the on the page on the screen. And then you will also have the copy of the link if you want to find more information, hopefully that you will support them and the work that they're doing. So 2 days of equity centered professional development. So that's another opportunity, really looking at the experiences of Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous people in Gifted Ed. So think about it. Also really looking at what they have to offer. And then today, I'm excited, y'all. I'm excited to have Dr. Jack Naglieri and Dr. Dina Perez here with us today. And they're going to talk about equity assessment. Well, I'm on equity assessments. I know some of you are using the ENAC. And so that's what our conversation is. I'm going to stop my share because I know Dr. Naglieri or Dr. Brunellis has a PowerPoint for us to share. Greetings and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Monica. I'm just going to try to get my screen under control.
Okay. And while he's doing that, he's provided a handout. I'm dropping that in the chat for everyone. And so here is the handout.
you might say a few words while I try to get everything set up?
Well, I'll jump in if that's all right.
Yes, please.
Wanted just to introduce this by saying that Jack and I and Kim have been working on an approach to achieving equity in gifted education for, I don't know, about 20, 25 years, probably longer for Jack. But so to introduce this, I'll just say that we started presenting a lot on the NNAT, and we kind of get at this question: what about the verbal and the quantitative aspect? Because the Naglieri nonverbal ability test, many of us have used for many, many years. I, as a former gifted director and coordinator, have used it in a couple different districts for about probably 30 years. And the question has always remained, what about the verbal and quantitative aspects? So about 15 years ago, Jack says to me, I think that we have to find a way to measure verbal ability and quantitative ability with kids that don't speak English, with kids who are from poverty, from kids who haven't had some of the privileges that other students may have had. So we are like, okay, how do we do that? And then about 10 years ago, he called and said, okay, I've got the answer. And so we embarked on this journey that we're on right now, and we're seeing some incredible results, which we're going to share with you today. So I don't know if Jack, you want to take it over from here?
Yeah, thanks, Dina. That's really helpful. I did put a link to this PDF of this presentation, so you have it, and it's easy for you to take a look at. I will let you know that you can get a lot of information on our website, Naglieri giftedtests.com, and see videos and other handouts and more details. And you can be in touch with us as well from the website. It's just the really big picture. Obviously, when we look for gifted children, we will change the course of that student's life. And oftentimes the tests that we use are going to have a big influence on whether or not that student actually winds up in a gifted program. And for us, what's most important is that whenever we assess a student, we need to use methods that allow us to understand how well the student can think in a way that's not confounded by what they know. And within that context, I like this quote from Albert Einstein: what is right is not always popular, and what is popular is not always right. Because we will be talking about looking at things differently today, and we'll help you with some of the science behind that. Just my own personal background, as a school psychologist many years ago, I noticed that the test that I was using was measuring ability in a way that was confounded by knowing. And that really didn't make sense to me. When I worked as a professor at Northern Arizona University and did some assessment of children in the Supai village, and in this particular case, a young lady who had a very low verbal score on the WISC and an average score on what we would call the nonverbal side. I wrote in my report that verbal score was basically not valid for this person. And of course, that's because the score was too confounded by what she didn't know. And of course, we still have those kinds of subtests on all the group and individually administered tests. But to clarify this, I want to remind you, when you use NNAT, my previous version, NNAT 3, you present a question like this. And to answer the question, the student simply needs to look at these relationships to arrive at the answer. Student does not need to use any words. If you did use words, it of course would require some knowledge, but the basic structure of the thinking is the same. If we used math, that would also require some knowledge. And now I'm going to give you a question that I would bet no one will know the answer to. Does anybody know the answer? If you do, just unmute and yell it out. Is anybody a musician? Michelle, I see you're responding to that. Maybe. If you might remember, certain chords form a pattern. C7 goes to F and E7 goes to. Want to take a stab at it, Michelle? Goes to A. Yeah. Now, that would be a really bad test on an question on an intelligence test, right? Because the score would be influenced by what a person knows. Now, over the many years when I published the different versions of my NNAT, which actually started in 1985, by the way, with the matrix analogies test that was renamed. All of these tests measure ability, general ability, in a way that's not confounded by knowledge. And these tests that I've published on for many years obviously have helped us because we know from the research that they're fair and equitable. But as Dina was saying, we need to be able to go beyond just the nonverbal. And even though we developed a book in 2008, him and Dina and I, to start to discuss the issues. What does NNAT really measure? It measures general ability. There's no such thing as nonverbal intelligence. And that measures general ability. And in 2016, Dina and Kim and I had the opportunity to create a new approach to measuring ability in a way that measured not only the nonverbal, but also verbal and quantitative, as Dina noted a few minutes ago. And yes, when I did suggest I had an idea, Dina and Kim kind of chuckled. It was a great moment for me personally to have these two wonderful professionals in the gifted field join with me on this effort to measure ability with a verbal test that could be solved in any language, with a quantitative test that could be solved in any language. And of course, I would create another nonverbal test. How do we do it? Well, the first thing we do is we take academic knowledge out of the measurement of the test questions so that verbal and quantitative, and I will show you this in a minute, verbal and quantitative tests can be solved using any language. And importantly, we wanted to take the verbal comprehension out of the directions. Because if you think about it, oftentimes there's a lot of verbal directions to a test. And those verbal directions can demand comprehension of verbal concepts, which students may not have. That's another obstacle. We use multiple choice responses so that there's no oral expression required. And we are also providing both local and national norms. So if you look at the top 6 tests that are used for identification of gifted children, according to this Gifted Ed survey, 5 out of the 6 demand knowledge. Only the NNAT doesn't. And what's the impact of that? In our book that Kim and Dina and I just published, we estimate that in the United States today, we have missed 1.25 million students of color in gifted ed. And that's just inexcusable. Because we can do better. And I want to clarify something that's a little bit esoteric, but really important. Sometimes people say, well, we can use those tests that were just shown because they don't have any test bias. But it's important to understand that test bias and test equity are both two parts of test fairness. Test bias is about the inner workings of the test. We call it psychometric analysis. But equity is about the content of the test questions. If the test demands questions, or knowledge rather, that a student doesn't have because of their background or the language that they speak, that test can be considered unfair. And that's the basis of what I'm going to show you next, which is also from our book, a collection of research studies done on all these different ability tests that clearly show tests that demand knowledge yield bigger differences by race and ethnicity, and tests that don't demand knowledge yield really small differences. That's the equity piece. It's all about the test content. So, of course, then everything gets even more complicated with COVID because some students, we know which ones we're talking about, didn't benefit quite as much as others during COVID. And so if we use any kind of a traditional intelligence test, group administered like OLSAT or COGAT, for example, that demand knowledge, we don't know how much COVID loss influenced the score.
I'd
So
like to jump in for a second here and
please,
Jack,
yeah.
and just remind everybody, but so there's a lot of research that's going on right now and looking at academic loss, knowledge loss during pre and post COVID. And one of the things that we wanted to emphasize here is that for the brown and black students, they were already behind before the pandemic. And then the learning loss that occurred during that pandemic impacted those students tremendously, much more than with white students. So by taking the academic knowledge out of the ability testing, we were able to measure how the child thinks as opposed to what they've learned, knowing that during the pandemic that that gap widened even more. A lot of the research is saying 11 to 14% respectively for brown and black students, less than with white students. So these kids in our schools that we're trying to identify that are smart, that have high ability, if we have that knowledge embedded into those ability tests, they're going to be at a further disadvantage. So they're already underrepresented based on the data that Jack just shared before the pandemic, but even more so after. So what we want to do is measure how the child thinks, processes information, sees relationships between ideas and concepts. And that's what these tests are trying to measure, as opposed to what the child has learned in the last few years. And that's the big difference between what we're trying to, the approach that we're taking as compared to the other tests that Jack just shared with you.
Yeah, and actually tests that have been used for 100 years, literally more than 100 years. So we do have a QR code on the bottom that would take you to the website that has more information. We have our emails here. Feel free always to email us, and we'll show you what these 3 tests look like next. So keep in mind that when I had the opportunity to move from the NNet 3 to these new tests, the goal was very explicit. We wanted to create 3 measures of verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal tests for equitable identification. So we want to find those students with potential. Like Monica showed the definition of gifted just a few minutes ago, with the underlined statement of shows potential. And that's what we are especially interested in. We want to find really smart kids who may not be reading on grade level even, but they're really smart. And we want to give them opportunity. What we measure with these 3 tests is what's called general ability. And we'll show you how that looks. Tina, would you talk about the verbal test, please?
Sure. So I worked with Jack on the verbal test. The 3 separate tests, all that measure general ability, avenues for measuring how the child thinks, processes information, sees relationships between ideas and concepts. And for the verbal, it's really seems like it would be a very complex proposition to measure verbal ability with a child who might not speak English. So if each of us in this presentation, in this group, were speaking a different language, we would all have the same opportunity to demonstrate our understanding of the verbal concept of verbal ability, ability as related to the verbal approach, because all of these, it's the construct of the test item, the verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal that measures general ability. So when you think about it that way, when you look at the verbal, when we think about objects, when we think about things, we're pretty much picturing things in our head. So despite the language that the person speaks. So basically these test items, and this is obviously very simplistic demonstration here, but we're looking at this item, we're looking at vessels, right? Looking at containers, things that hold something. And so there's going to be outliers in each of the items. So when if the child is presented with these pictures, one might think, oh, well, there's a box that can close. There's a basket that has holes in it. These two of the items have handles. One of them is blue, one's brown, one's clear. So there's a lot of distractors, but the child has to really think about what is the difference? What is one thing that they all have in common? And that is that they're all empty except for item number 2. So the child has to think about the different representations of the items that are presented and think about how they correlate, how they fit together. And so a child is thinking about that using language. We all think with language, and it could be a different language that we're all thinking with, but the items basically, it's a conceptual understanding of language is what are these pictures? How do they work together and what's different, basically. And this can work with children from kindergarten up through high school. And what we found when we were working with some of these items and testing them out is the kids get super excited about them. There's a lot of dialogue and conversation, and they want to talk to each other about what each other was thinking. And I was a coordinator for a school district at the time when we were developing these items, and I had an opportunity to work with a lot of kids at different grade levels. And the one thing which is very unique about these tests is that the kids were so excited about taking them and about thinking about these questions that they were presented with. And as a coordinator, I've given hundreds of tests. I've never seen kids so excited about taking a test as with these tests that we're sharing with you today.
Thanks, Tina. Show you what I hope I can show you what the animated instructions look like. I think not. Thought I fixed this, but apparently I didn't. So I'll just describe to you what happens. So when administering, there there's this little video that plays. There's no audio. And what happens is there's a thought bubble that comes up on the top right hand side. In that thought bubble, the 6 images appear. The 5 images kind of merge together, and there's a yellow line that goes around all of them. And then the image of the chair pulsates. And then the scene changes to basically what's here. And the little avatar hand moves as the cursor moves. First, it touches on option 5. That's incorrect. We wanted to show the kids they can change their answer. Then it goes to 4, the correct, and then it goes to that forward arrow. So we teach the student what to do, how to do it, and how to do the next one without saying a word. Think about that. That's awesome, right? And it works. It works beautifully. The nonverbal that I created is conceptually like the NNet3. I really like it. I think of it as like the next step from the NNet3 because I created new ways of making matrices items because I don't want testing mom to know what they look like. I don't tell anybody. But, you know, they're all conceptually the same. What does it measure? It measures the extent to which the student can understand the relationships among shapes, how they change to arrive at the answer, just like understanding relationships in the verbal. And then, again, we have the same kind of animated instructions for the nonverbal. And then the quantitative. Tina, do you want to talk about quantitative?
Sure. Our colleague Kim Lansdowne worked on the quantitative test with Jack. And basically, this is obviously a very simplistic way of showing the child how to answer the question. Because in the directions that Jack was just describing, as you know, when we're doing sample test items, we want to make sure that at least 94% of the students are able to answer that question, because what we're trying to show them is the process. So, but what we did with the quantitative is there's 3 different formats for the test items. And basically what they're trying to do is taking a lot of once again, the academic knowledge out of the testing and so that the students can answer the questions. And so there's some questions that are more algebraic and some more sequential like this, but basically they don't require that students have learned some of the algorithms that exist in mathematics. So there's no word problems, obviously, because we've taken the language out of these tests, so they can be solved with students regardless whatever language they're speaking. So for this sample test item, the child would just, same process that Jack just described, will look at the visual. And so for this sample item, the girl is looking at the balance scale on the left-hand side. Oh, 2 triangles equal 2 circles. Therefore, 1 triangle must equal 1 circle. And so that's just the thought process of how the children are going to learn the directions for taking the test, and the sample items depict the different formats of the test structure.
Thanks, Tina. So keep in mind that even though the tests have different content, they all measure general ability. Most people confuse the terms verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative with an ability, but really that's a description of the test content. And that's very, very important to keep in mind. Now, one of the things that I always like to rely on whenever I publish any of my tests is evidence that they work. And I was really pleased with the publisher, MHS, when they conducted this group of 3 research studies to look at differences across race, ethnicity, gender, and parental ed. Now, for the nonverbal test, I've been doing that for decades, so I knew that we wouldn't get any kind of gender differences, race, ethnicity differences, and so on. And notice that the sample is 3,600 people, 8 to 12 who represent the US population, but we didn't know, would the verbal test work as well? And for 2,500 kids, it did. No gender, no race, no parental ed. And the same was true for the quantitative. So we replicated the study 3 times with 3 different kinds of tests, 3 different kinds of content. We take the knowledge out of the measurement of general ability, we get equity.
So one of the big things here is, I mean, it's huge. It's not just big, it's huge. The third item here, no parental education differences. So a child whose parents might be migrant field workers and whose parents different compared to the child whose parents might be doctors or engineers or lawyers, they're going to have equal opportunity to demonstrate how they their potential for learning, their ability. And when Jack shared with you that chart with the kids that were missing, those are the kids that were missing. And that's why we need to do something differently with how we're measuring that potential to learn, because the kids that concern us the most are the kids that have that potential but are not yet demonstrating that achievement level in school. And face it, most of the people in our schools do not have a lot of background in gifted education, unless you are like one of you in this, you make a concerted effort to learn more about these kids, or you're a parent of children who have been identified as gifted, or you went through gifted programs yourself. You're probably not going to understand how that child thinks, processes information, if it's in a different language or a different culture or different levels of support prior to coming to school. And so for this research evidence, after we've developed these tests, this is what convinced us that we can find these kids that we've been missing for all of these years in our schools. They exist. We just have to find a different way to understand how they're thinking.
Okay, so let's pause here and see what kind of questions and thoughts you all have.
You're welcome just to pop a question into the chat box if you've got, or something
Yes.
you want to ask. Or just shout out.
Yeah, just unmute.
Okay, we have a quiet group this morning, Jack.
You can see that.
Okay. We'll get more opportunity at the end to ask some questions if some come up.
Okay. I think we do the best we can with what we know. When we know better, we do better. I mean, that's what we just showed you, the research, right? It's to know and to understand what we're trying to do here. That, that takes time and energy and courage to think differently. And maybe you could speak for a little bit about this, what next after they're identified.
So one of the things that I have found over the years in this field is that sometimes people are a little reluctant to identify kids for gifted services who don't speak English fluently or who are not achieving at a certain level, because a lot of our programs are designed for highly achieving students that are very motivated, that have some that have demonstrated they're ready for advanced academics. But like I just mentioned, there's a lot of these kids that we're missing that just don't have that that preparation prior to coming into our schools. So unfortunately, in our field, a lot of times what we do is we have a gifted program that we try to identify kids are going to be successful in that program. And our approach is somewhat different. We want to identify the kids who have that potential, have that high ability, who are not yet achieving, to make sure that we can embrace them into our programs for those kids that have advanced learning needs, which these kids do, even if they're not speaking English fluently. So I see in the chat, someone is asking about some of the students with disabilities can be gifted and talented. Absolutely. There are some kids that might be dyslexic, dysgraphic, ADD, or on the spectrum, that sometimes there's obstacles in the way that we're measuring how they think and process information. And so we're trying to give them a different avenue to demonstrate their ability. And once we do that, we think, okay, now what do we do with them? So some of you might have known some of my past work on cluster grouping and flexible grouping. And what we want to do is we want to identify these kids with potential and then include them and then group them together and then teach them along with this same type of instructional strategies that we're using for those kids who are high ability, but also already high achieving. Because what we have found is that once we do look at them as gifted kids with high potential, with high ability, then they will make those academic advances that we have not seen in the past, because we have not recognized that they have that potential for learning. And in our book that we just published this last fall, Understanding and Using the Naglieri General Ability Test, basically what we're doing in the chapters that I wrote, or that is just on programming and instruction. Okay, we've identified these kids. We brought them through the process of making sure that we understand their true potential. Now, what do we do with them? And that's what Jack alluded to earlier in the presentations. First part is to identify these kids. And the second thing is to say, okay, we know they're smart. Now, how are we going to serve them? And so this is a very inclusionary type of approach, thinking as opposed to some of the approaches for identifying students that we've experienced in the past.
So the question about dyslexia, we do discuss that in our book, but I do have another handout that I can send anyone if you send me an email after we're done here. I can send you a copy of the handout that I have on Twice Exceptional. And but I'll answer the question now. The typical dyslexic student who has the phonological task failure is a student who has a weakness in a specific cognitive processing called successive processing in my other work on individual assessment. So we would not expect students with dyslexia to have a low score on any of these three general tests because they're not specifically getting at that specific ability. So take a look at my presentation, and I'm happy to discuss that more with whoever wants to be in touch with me about the question of dyslexia and these instruments.
So another question just came up from Kenna Moody, who said that she uses the NNet3, but the matrix that they're required to use, I believe, in the state says that they need 3 separate measures. That's why we created this test the way we did. It's a verbal, a quantitative, and a nonverbal test that are separate from each other. So they are 3 different measures, if that is what your state is requiring. And as we know, across the country, all the states have different criteria for identification of gifted students. But the other thing I want to emphasize here is that even if your state has this different criteria, like some states have creativity, leadership, other things. What we want to make sure that we're doing here is identifying the kids with potential. Even if it doesn't match what the state's requiring at that moment for the official identification, it's still information that schools need to know, that teachers need to know, that these kids have very high ability. But our test we did design it with that mindset that these are 3 different measures, separate measures. Whereas, for example, some tests have a verbal, quantitative, and nonverbal battery for the test. These have research that measures their effectiveness in measuring ability separately from each other. So I hope that clarifies a little bit of what you were asking, Ken.
So my understanding is we have like 4 minutes left, right, Monica?
We usually go to the hour, so you got some time.
Okay.
Got a few minutes.
Tina, did you want to go through any of these other issues on the back end?
Sure. One of the big things in our field is that we're looking at, a lot of times we look at gifted and talented. And so what we wanted to do is separate these two constructs, that gifted means really smart kids and talented means very accomplished. So yeah, sure, it's fabulous to identify gifted and talented kids. But if we remove the talented part and we're just looking at the gifted part, we're going to be able to identify a lot of kids who are smart that just haven't had opportunities to learn that other kids may have had, other kids in their grade level that may have had. So another thing that we did with these tests is we designed them initially to using just local norms. So basically the national norms that we are being developed for this test are going to be out in the fall, so very shortly. But what we wanted to also emphasize here is that we want to measure which kids in your schools are furthest removed from the norm, meaning that they need something different. They need a different curriculum and instructional approach than the other kids that are within that average range. And so there's always this little bubble of kids that are outside of that average that have higher ability. But some of them, if the schools, most teachers do not have that background in gifted education, if they don't see that talented aspect, that accomplishment that we see in academic achievement, if they don't have that, they're not going to recognize that potential. So that's why we really want to distinguish between the gifted and talented pieces, so that we make sure that we're going to find these kids that have been missing for a long time because they have that ability, but haven't yet had that achievement level. And as this slide points out, we know that the pandemic has widened that gap, because a lot of kids with some opportunities to learn, and we're talking like you're saying, thinking, well, it's been a year after the pandemic. Yes. But a lot of these kids, K2 especially, once they started school, they'd missed some of that instruction. So what we're finding is a lot of, especially in the early education years, that these kids, some of these kids that are smart, they just didn't have that academic attention or to demonstrate so that they can demonstrate their ability.
I just want to emphasize on this image here that universal testing for all students is what we're advocating for, because many times these really smart students who are not achieving well won't be identified by a teacher or someone. So by universal testing, we can find everybody.
So basically what we're talking about is a nomination process. And in our country, a lot of times in most states, it's usually a parent or a teacher saying, this kid looks really smart. Let's test them to see if they're gifted. But when we say universal testing of all students, obviously we can't test everybody in the school every year. So what our suggestion and what I did as a gifted coordinator and director, select a couple grade levels, maybe a primary and maybe an intermediate grade level, and test those 2 grade levels at each school every year. And then when the kids matriculate into those grade levels, we're going to be catching all of the kids. If we can't test all of the kids in the school, at least identify a couple grade levels, depending on the school structure and what you have, if it's elementary to middle school or whatever. But our tests they're designed for kids K through 9. So we were able to use them at different trajectories of their schooling years.
Yeah, and I'd like to just clarify that when we use the term universal testing, not universal screening, because screening implies that the screening tools might not be used for identification. But what we're suggesting is that if you give these three tests, three separate tests, you have 3 data points, and those data points are all very valid and very reliable for making the decision of, yes, this looks like a child who should be in a gifted program.
And one thing to emphasize here is that we're really not trying to advocate only for these tests. We're trying to advocate for the kids that have been missing by other ability tests. And Jack already mentioned it's a construct of the test item that makes it verbal, nonverbal, or quantitative, but they're all different avenues for measuring general ability. And that really pertains to how the child thinks, processes information, makes inferences, seeing connections between ideas and information, which is what we do in school, right? So one of the things that we've also recognized is that the message that we're sending to parents after we are testing these kids, what does this mean? So in our book, Understanding Using the Naglieri General Ability Test, the first 2 chapters basically talk about the whole testing procedure, testing items, and what measuring general ability means and looks like. And then the next part of the book, which Kim wrote, is basically all of the functionalities that we have to use in the schools, the parent letters, how we test, how we group the students for testing, how we measure, what we do with the scores, how we use the building norms or one version of local norms in order to identify which kids need different services. And then the last part of the chapters, as I mentioned before, what I wrote on programming instruction. Okay, now we've identified these kids that were really smart with high ability and high potential. What do we do with them? So it doesn't impact how we approach our programming and instruction in our schools, because a lot of times schools are afraid to identify kids that are for gifted services who are not academically achieving at high levels, because our programs are designed for those kids. So the answer is pretty simple: redesign, reimagine how you are serving these kids based on what the kids need, not on what the services that we've designed and are faithful to using for decades, but what these kids with high potential need in order to pursue that, to develop that potential. And that's our whole goal in school and working with these kids, is to help all the kids develop their potential, regardless of the language they speak, regardless of their skin color, and regardless of whatever opportunities they have had prior to coming to school.
And as Dina said, these 3 separate instruments that we developed explicitly for equitable assessment be used in combination. And we wanted to give people that opportunity. If they wanted to do all 3, then they have 3 data points, 3 really powerful data points. And as I said earlier, the NNet 3 was a previous version of my nonverbal test, but this version here is the most recent, the most up-to-date, most recently normed, and as I said, different only in some way in which the items were written, so that we have more security in terms of people trying to prep kids to get in.
As a practitioner, which I believe most of you are, we also want to emphasize the importance of using local norms to group students in our schools. And I don't care how you group, but it's important that you do group these kids, because these kids with that, if we're measuring that they have higher ability, but they're not achieving yet, in my practice in 2 different large districts for the last 25, 30 years, I used the NNAT and I used to cluster group to get these kids together, to group them all together, because once we find that they're smart and we start treating them equally as if they are all smart, regardless of their backgrounds or cultures or achievement levels, we're going to find that these kids make extreme advances in their academics, more so than they would have if we isolated them and didn't include them. So what we really want to do is emphasize the local norm aspect, recognizing that many states require national norms as well. And so, so once again, those national norms are going to be coming out in this coming school year, but during the pandemic, when we realized we were starting to collect data on national norms prior, and then we thought we can't wait, because we know that the schools have these kids in their classrooms right now. So if we can use local norms to compare a student's performance at a grade level with other students in that district or in that school or in that specific grade, then we can group them, even if it's informally, because on local norms, it's not always going to be to your state criteria, but that's okay, because we're still helping the child. We're still identifying which children need more specific instruction in order to advance academically at rates that are commensurate with their ability levels. So that's why we started with local norms, but we are moving to the national norms as well, so that we have those 2 options.
Just monitoring the chat box. I don't see anything else. I don't know, maybe we just have some closing comments. Just curious what you all think about this. You can just put in the chat. Anything that you'd like to ask in the last few minutes that we have, please do.
While you're thinking about that, one of the closing comments that I have is that Kim and I are both, like I said, practitioners, coordinators, and what we have found was what I alluded to earlier is that this is a fun way of measuring how the kids think and how they process information and how they see relationships and make connections between ideas and information. And I've been in districts for decades, and I've never seen kids so excited about taking a test as these kids when they're. And so what we have found when we were working with the students is afterward, they have all these rich discussions about the items and this. And I thought, well, that's really intriguing, because they are engaged and they want to try to solve these problems. And that's not what we always see with some of the different tests that are out there. So it was just a very unexpected outcome of when we were developing the test, to realize that the kids got excited about them.
I think some people have had trouble accessing the handout, but if you go up to the top of the chat, Monica put it in at 10:19. You can just click on that and it'll download.
So the other thing I want to mention here is that, first of all, Vanessa is asking, does the book include ways to develop and determine local norms? Absolutely. And the most important thing is that MHS, the test developer, they have an onboarding specialist that actually will work with the school districts when they're providing the test, and then the follow-up as well. Because there's a lot of different ways that we can use our building norms or local norms. It could be by percentile, it could be by ranking, it could be by different ways. to use that data in order to figure out which kids are at the highest levels. So yes, the MHS, our test developer, and of course, we will we work with the districts to help determine what those results mean. But the other thing I wanted to mention here is that, and maybe Jack can put into the chat box, our website, Naglieri giftedtest.com. We're having a live Q&A on April 19th, and that's at 7:00 Eastern time. So I believe it's 5:00 for Texas. And basically, the three of us are just going to be chatting with everybody, and it'll be recorded, so it'll be on our website later on. But just a lot of this how-to information and what the tests are all about. So maybe you can join us. Hopefully you'll be able to join us. Some of you will be able to join us for that live Q&A on April 19th.
I just want to clarify something, that as far as local norms, the local norms are created by the publisher when the test is administered. So you give the 3 tests. The mechanism for scoring is there. You get the scores based upon the local norms as you define it. So you could have local norm for a district, or portion, a group of classes, a group of schools or individual schools, however you want to have that. It's done automatically. It's what you get when you use this mechanism that we've created. All right, so I guess we're good. Monica, thanks again for inviting us to do this, and Dina for getting up so early.
I'm in Arizona, by the way. We're a little bit earlier than you.
Yes, yes. So thank you both. Great information, great information. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Hopefully this conversation and this information will give you a little bit more knowledge of when you're evaluating your programs, evaluating your next steps, and thinking about, so someone said they're looking at their next assessment and what they're going into. As you know, I just want to make sure that you have all the info out there that you can possibly have as you look forward. And then I'm going to throw a challenge out there to you, Dr. Jack and Dr. Dina, really thinking of a couple of conversations here in the state of Texas is always on secondary programming and really looking at secondary testing, because we got those kids who miss out earlier of being identified. And then we also have a large blind population that's always seeking for gifted testing also. So maybe a Braille test at one time. So just kind of things for food for thought out there, or some options for that. So, but I want to say thank you, everyone. If there are any final questions, they have put their Dr. Jack has put his email in the chat. So feel free to send them to him. I will make sure that this info in the handout is uploaded on the website. And happy Tuesday, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Thank y'all for joining me, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.